Now, every company or nonprofit, or most all, has what we call a mission statement. They have some kind of sentence or statement that expresses their purpose. It's their why. Here's what we seek to accomplish. And this statement is supposed to let everyone who sees it know this is kind of why we exist and what we are here to do. I got a couple mission statements I want to show you from companies, just as examples of what these are, and maybe you'll see if they fulfill these or not in your life. The first is Google. Probably everybody's heard of Google, right? Yeah, we've all probably used it, in fact, okay? So Google's mission statement is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful, right? So Google fulfills that mission probably for us, right? I'd be lost without Google. I wouldn't be able to get anywhere. It tells me things that I need to know, right? The information's there. It makes it accessible to me. But Microsoft, to empower every person in every organization on the planet to achieve more. So here, they build things, they build technology, they do things that help businesses or individuals be able to achieve more with that. If we got rid of Microsoft and got rid of all their technology, we would achieve less, right? So they fulfill that mission, I think, fairly well. But Netflix, to entertain the world. It's a lofty goal. Starbucks, to inspire and nurture the human spirit. One person, one cup, one neighborhood at a time. We at Starbucks today, I don't think my spirit was moved at all. Not quite sure how they do that, but that's what they're trying to do, all right? So next time you have some coffee, ask, my spirit might be worse today without coffee, right? Let's be honest. Tesla, to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. Okay? Now, I suppose they're achieving that. I don't know about the transition, right? But they're building things that use sustainable energy. So they're fulfilling that mission. How about Mount Zion? We have a mission statement that you as a congregation have approved whenever you approved it. I don't know, I wasn't here. And it's in our Constitution. And it simply says this: it is the mission of this church to obey the Great Commandment and fulfill the Great Commission both at home and abroad. So our mission statement is tied to two scripture verses. One we call the Great Commission. We talked about this last week. To go into all the world. We're to go to people and do what? Make disciples of them. Help them to find the life that God has called them to live and to walk in that path. Baptizing them like we did today. Not in a way that brings change to their life, but baptism notes that God has worked a change in us. And we're ready to make that known. Teaching them to obey all the things that Jesus told us. We don't have the answers. Jesus has the answers. He's told us how to live, and we're simply sharing with everyone else what we've been taught from Him on how we can best live this life. That is one of our church's purposes, why we exist. The other is called the Great Commandment. And we actually see this in different places. The passage here that's listed in our mission statement is Luke 10:27. That is actually a passage that comes not from the mouth of Jesus, but from somebody else. But in Matthew 22, we hear the same words from the mouth of Jesus. So we're going to look at both times they're repeated to ask ourselves, if this is our mission as a church, if this is what we say our why, our purpose, we should understand what these verses are and what is being said to us in these verses. And this verse calls us to do a simple thing, to love. That love is our mission. It is our purpose. That we as a church exist to share and grow the love here, at home, and abroad, and around the world. What does that mean? What does that look like? So let's look at these two verses today to help us understand exactly what they mean. So that this is a time, I've seen this a lot this week, that everybody wants to define love the way that they want to define love, right? We all have our own definitions of what it means to love, of who we should love, of what it looks like. The world will constantly give us the definitions of what love is and what it looks like. But we need to look at what Jesus said about love to understand what our purpose is so that we don't confuse what we think about love. And we're going to see that some of the people Jesus talks to here are trying to impose their standards of who they're supposed to love on Jesus' answers. And we don't want to make that same mistake. So let's hear what Jesus says here. We're going to read this first. This is Matthew 22, verse 35 to 40. We're going to stop along the way and just talk about this passage. The first verse says, one of them, an expert in religious law, tried to trap Jesus with this question. So we start out, we have an expert in religious law, a lawyer. He studies the law, he knows the law backwards and forwards, he knows everything about it. There were 613 commands that they had broken the law into. They took the law, what we have in the Old Testament, they broke it into 613 separate commands. There were 300, they had positive and negative commands. There were 365 negative commands. So they made sure that every day of the year you had a negative command, do not do this. Then they had 248 positive commands. Here's what you're supposed to do. And they would debate this question that this man is about to ask Jesus. Look in verse 36. He says, "Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses?" So what they would do with these 613 commands is they would debate not just what the top one was, they would literally rank them. They'd have our list from 1 to 613. What's the most important? What's the least important? And they debated it. They argued it. One rabbi said the most important command is Proverbs 3:6. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Another rabbi said it's Habakkuk 2:4. The righteous shall live by faith. Another famous rabbi, Hillel, he lived a couple decades before Jesus. There's a story of a Gentile that came to Judaism, and so he went to this famous rabbi, the most famous of his day, and he said, "Rabbi, you got all these laws I got to learn. What's the most important commandment?" And he actually gave him one that's not a part of all those. He gave him the opposite of the golden rule. What you hate done to you, do not do to anyone else. And he said that's the entire law. That's all that God wants. Everything else that he says is commentary on that, on how to do that. So when he asked Jesus this question, notice it says this is a trap. The question itself is not the trap. The trap is the answer. He wants Jesus to give an answer that he then can take and kind of say, it's like a gotcha moment, right? So if I went to you and said something like, let's say you told me I don't have a political party, okay? I'm independent. And I'd say, oh, okay. Hey, what do you believe about abortion? Your answer is going to allow me to trap you and say, well, see, you belong to this party or that party, correct? That's what he's trying to do to Jesus. As soon as he gives an answer, he's going to say, hey, that means you are a disciple of this rabbi or that rabbi. He can kind of put him in a camp, and then by doing that can speak against him. But Jesus gives an answer that no rabbi had given. And he gives him two commandments. He says this. Jesus replied, this is verse 37, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments." Now, what Jesus says at the end there, first he says, love God with everything you have. Okay? Deuteronomy 6:5. It's a verse he gives. This is a part of a prayer that every Jew would pray every day, known as the Shema. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, all your mind. Love him with everything. That's the first. He says that's the first and greatest command. But second is equally important. And the second, Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus then says, The entire law. All of the rules, all the commandments, everything you know of the law. That's everything in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all that part. That's what they're talking about. All of that. And all of the prophets. The prophets were the people through whom God spoke his word. So Jesus says, everything you know about the law and how to live life, everything you know about what God has said, look at what he says, hangs on these two commandments. If you don't have these two commandments, everything that God asks his people to do, everything that God spoke falls. It can't stand. Love is what the entirety of what God has asked us to be and do hangs upon. Now, what does that look like? What does that mean? How do we do that? See, we have this problem as Christians. I'll use this story to illustrate it. In the 3rd and 4th century, there were people that we know as desert fathers. They essentially were monks. And these monks, they would go off and they would live in the desert, hence the name Desert Fathers. What they would do is they were going out, as monks do, with some kind of commitment or some kind of, they had some calling in life. Very pious, dedicated, righteous men, right? So they would go off and live in the desert. One of them that's not necessarily well known was a man by the name of Nathaniel. And Nathaniel went out and he lived in his house. And Nathaniel said, I am going to love God with everything, just like he commanded. That's the most important commandment. So what I'm going to do is I'm never going to leave this house. I'm going to live in this house all the time. I don't know how he did that. I don't know how he got food. I don't know, but that's what he did. That's what his story says. This is history. He lived in his house. He never left the threshold of his house because he said, God is here with me, and I'm never going to leave the presence of God. I'm just going to dedicate myself reading his word, praying. I'm just going to love God. Well, one day, Nathaniel gets a knock on his door. When you live in a little house in the desert, people don't come to your door. So Nathaniel wasn't used to this. And he went to the door and he opened it, and it was a 10-year-old little boy. And the 10-year-old boy was clearly injured. And the boy told him a story. It was his job to get communion for the local church. He went and got bread. And so he rode his donkey to a baker in another town. He got bread and he was bringing it back. And his donkey's hoof slipped and he threw him off the donkey. And his donkey is injured and dying and he's hurt. And he needs help. And then he said, please, sir, this is what the story says. Please allow me to come into your house so that I do not get eaten by hyenas. And apparently this is the thing. Like, there are hyenas where they lived, and if he'd stay out there, they would eat him. He would die. So Nathaniel was stuck. He stood in the threshold of his door, and he said in his own head, I know I'm supposed to love my neighbor as myself, but to do this, I'm going to have to leave my house. And I've committed my life to staying in this house so that I can love God with everything that I have. So to help him and follow that command, I have to stop loving God. So he thought through it for a while, and then he said to him, son, I believe that if you truly are serving the God that I serve, he will send you help. And he shut the door. See, this is what we do. We'll call it compartmentalize. We've separated the two. That loving God and loving people are two separate things. And I love God over here, and loving people happens over there. And so we come into the threshold of our house, and we sit and we come, and let's talk about how much we love God and how great God is and how he never lets us down and he's good and he's faithful and all the things that we sing and love and are abundantly true in all of our lives. But we sit here and we do that and we disconnect it so often with the truth that we're also supposed to love our neighbors. Because when we leave out of this threshold and we become different people who are not singing songs about how good God is and how he never lets us down, and then we let down the entire world as we fail to love them as Jesus has loved us. These two are inseparable. It's what Jesus is saying. If you love God, then you love everyone in your life. And you cannot love God and not love the people who are in your life. Now, here's the question that will always be asked. See, we define love in a lot of ways, right? And our culture talks about love like it's a feeling, it's something in our hearts, I feel it inside, it's butterflies in our stomach, whatever. That's not what love is. Love in Scripture is an action, right? John 13, Jesus is about ready to go to the cross, and what does he say to his disciples? The world will know that you are my disciples by your love, by how you love one another. It is a definitional action of following Jesus, is loving. It's not something we feel, it's something that we do. Scripturally, love is a verb. It's always an action. So here's the question that we'll ask. We want to ask, like, how do we do that? What does that look like? Here's the question. It gets asked to Jesus. Luke 10. Similar story, right? This is verse 25. One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus. And he asked him this question. Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Same situation, different question. And Jesus does something. He does two things in this passage, actually. The first thing he does is Jesus likes to answer a question with a question. Do you all know somebody like that? Right? Nobody ever likes that. But Jesus, knowing it's a trap, he asks him a question. He turns the tables and he says, you're the expert. You tell me. What does the law say? Verse 26. What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it? Listen, this is what the expert on the law says. The man answered, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, all your strength, all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, right. Do that and you will live. I just want to stop right there for a second. Listen to that. Love and you will live. Love is the essence of life. We feel every day like we are dying. And the world is stripping life away from us. And the only way that we find the life that Jesus has for us in this world is through loving. It's the only way to come to the life that he has for you. So when we're struggling and when we're hurting, the only way to find that new life, the only way to get up out of that muck and mire that we're stuck in is to love. Well, Jesus says, do that. Yeah, love God with everything, love your neighbor as yourself, and find life. And then the expert of the law asks the question that we all ask. Verse 29. Love your neighbor as yourself. Who is my neighbor? Who am I supposed to love? Tell me which people. But listen to this. Listen to what the verse says. The man wanted to justify his actions. So he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? What that means is this. There are people in his life he did not love. And he wanted an answer from Jesus that said, I want to do the things that lead to life. I want to do the things that give me the life that God wants for me. And I understand that means to love, but there's some people I don't want to love. Maybe there's a lot of people I don't want to love, right? So give me a list. Tell me exactly who I have to love. Tell me who I can love and who I don't have to love. So the second thing Jesus does to people like this expert is he answers them with a story. It's the kind of stories that we're going to begin to talk about next week. This story is a very well-known story. You know it. It's known throughout the world. It's called the Good Samaritan. We still use that term all the time, right? This is the story Jesus told to answer the question, who are you supposed to love? And if that is the fundamental thing that we have to do to find life, then we should know this story and understand what Jesus is saying in it, right? Story's simple. A man is going from Jerusalem to Jericho. That's north. Not a long trip, but there's only one real road to get from Jerusalem to Jericho at that time, and it's not a particularly safe road. In fact, people often traveled in groups to stay safe there, but in this story, this man does not. He's going from Jerusalem to Jericho, and on his way, a group of bandits, of robbers, they attack him. They take his clothes, they take everything he has, and then it says they leave him for dead. Notice it doesn't say that he's dead, but they leave him for dead. He's probably going to die from what has happened to him. And in the story, Jesus says 3 different men walk beside him. They see him along the way. It's a well-traveled road, and inevitably somebody's going to come by him. And so the first 2 people are the same. It's a priest and a Levite. And the priest and the Levite, they come and they walk and they see the man by the side of the road. They see his state, and it says they move to the other side of the road and walk by. They get as far away from him as they can, and they keep walking. Now, this is a priest and a Levite. Okay? If you don't know who that is, these are people who work in the temple. The priest would have been in charge of sacrifices, in charge of leading worship, that had many roles in the temple. The Levite would have been a temple worker, would have done a number of other things in the temple to help lead worship of God. The righteous people. You would think they would at least poke the guy with a stick to see if he's living, right? But that's not what they do. They move to the other side and just keep going. Just keep walking. Why? Why do they do that? There's 2 answers that we normally give to that question. The first is, maybe they're afraid, right? Guy just got robbed on the side of the road. I don't want to hang out where people are getting robbed. Right? That makes sense. Maybe. Jesus doesn't say that. Maybe that's the case. The second is we say, well, because they're righteous, they don't want to be unclean. They don't want to touch a dead body. That's not the answer. There's a couple of reasons why that's definitely not the answer. Number 1, because the guy's not dead. Nothing in the passage says that it even looks like he's dead. That he's left for dead. He clearly needs help. Number 2, let's assume that they did say that he was dead. Here's the problem. Being clean, if you don't understand what that means for them to go into the temple and do the things that they're supposed to do, they have to be clean. They can't be unclean. Touching a dead body makes you unclean. One of many things that makes you unclean. The problem is this. They are worried about being clean when they come into the temple, right? They're coming to work. I got to take a shower before I go to work. Got to clean up beforehand. They would have inevitably done that anyways coming into the temple. They would have went through all the rituals to make sure they were clean. Well, listen, the road is going from where? Jerusalem to Jericho. They are not going to Jerusalem, to the temple. They've just finished work and are going home. They are not going where they have to be worried about being clean. They've just finished that work and they're going home. There were so many priests and Levites, they would only work for a week or 2 a year there. This wasn't something that they did all the time. Number 2, if he was dead, the law obligates them to bury a dead body. It is a great offense to not bury a dead body, and priests and Levites were not exempt from that law. So if they thought he was dead, they'd actually been breaking the law by doing so, by walking on the other side. They knew he wasn't dead, so why did they walk on the other side? I think the answer is very simple. Because they think they're above that. See, they're a priest and a Levite. They are an expert on the law, much like the man Jesus is talking to. You see, to be a priest or a Levite, you had to be born into that. You couldn't go to school. You couldn't study for that. You couldn't become that. You were that. You were born that way. And they believe God has chosen us, right, to do this job, to go and lead His people in worship, to go and work in the temple. So we are special. And so they see this man and are saying, we're special. We are above that. We're not going to stoop down to someone like that. I don't have to love people like that. that are hurting, that are wounded, that are left for dead. Then, there's a third person. Jesus says this man walks and he stops. He checks on him, clothes him, wraps him up, puts him on his own animal. That means that he's going to walk the rest of the way. He leads the man and takes him to an inn where he pays for the man to be taken care of. He's already disinfected his wounds. It's one of the first things he does. But now they wrap him up and they bandage him. He pays for a room. He gives 2 silver coins, which would pay for some amount of stay, and then goes to the innkeeper and says, I'll be back through. Clearly travels the road a lot. I'll be back through, and if there's more charges, I'll pay for the rest of it. Just take care. Give him whatever he needs. Oh, and he's a Samaritan. Now, that doesn't mean a whole lot to us when we say that word. But to a Jewish audience, it means a lot. And it means they hated the Samaritans. They hated them because the Samaritans were what they would call half-breeds, which means when the Assyrian Empire took the northern kingdom of Israel, we learned about the Babylonian exile, and that's when they took people like Daniel and they took them to Babylon, right? They took the best and brightest, they took them to Babylon and they taught them about their culture, and then they would send them back home and go teach your people about it. That's not what the Assyrians did. The Assyrians would come in and they would take over your people, and then they would take half of them and they would move you somewhere else. And then they would take people from somewhere else and move them into where you lived. And then you would start families together. And so I'm going to mix half of this Jewish population with other people from around the world. That's where the Samaritans came from. They started intermarrying, and then suddenly their whole religion changed. They no longer went to the temple. They believed in the law. They believed they were from Abraham, but they worshiped on a mountain. They had all these other different things that they did. So the Jewish people saw them as a complete corruption of them, of the chosen people. And they hated them for that. He's the guy that stops and helps the man on the side of the road. And now, at the end, listen, Jesus stops and he says, now, this is verse 36. Which of these 3 men would you say is a neighbor to the man who was attacked by the bandits? Now notice the expert on the law's answer. His answer is, the one who showed him mercy. He doesn't say the Samaritan. He's not going to say that word. And he doesn't say not the Levite or the priest, not somebody like me. He's not going to say that word. The one who showed him mercy. Understand, Jesus says, so go do that. Go be like the Samaritan. Go do what the Samaritan did. Love is an action. It's something that we do. And so when we looked at their lives, when Jesus looked at their lives, he asked this question: which of these 3 men loved their neighbors? Which of these 3 men was a neighbor? See, to love a neighbor, that means I'm a neighbor, right? We're both neighbors. I'm going to be the neighbor. I make them my neighbor by how I live. And so Jesus' answer is, fundamentally, who's my neighbor? Everyone that you're a neighbor to. Everyone that you actually love, which means we are supposed to be that way to everyone our lives come in contact with. We should influence and impact their lives with the love of Jesus in such a way that we now have a relationship with them. Because we've loved God with everything that we have, and he's changed our hearts. It changed how we view the world around us. We think there are Levites and priests in our world that we think they're the ones closest to God. And there's people that we look down upon and that we don't like that actually live the life that God called them to. And are exhibiting that love, that mercy, that compassion, that kindness that Jesus did. And so the question is, who are you measuring your life against? Because we want to believe all the right things, and that's good and that's important. We should believe and know. It is important that our minds are changed by who Jesus is. But our minds are changed so that we can know the will of God, so that we can live out His will for us, which is to love one another. So if you truly believe the right things, it changes how you live. It changes your actions and who you are. Jesus is saying to have His life, live like the Samaritan. Because we walk by people every day who are wounded, who are hurting, who are desperate, who are needy. And we are to take what we have and use it to help them find healing and hope. In the 70s, they did this experiment at Princeton. And Princeton has a seminary where they train pastors. And so what they did was they took all these students who were training to be pastors. And they told them, we're sending you to go preach a sermon on the Good Samaritan. And they told them where they were going on campus. You're going to go here, and you got this assignment for this class. Go to this room, and you're going to preach a sermon on the Good Samaritan. Didn't give any time to prep or anything. And then they told them, oh, and it happens in like 5 minutes. You got to go now. And they would run across campus and try to get to this classroom to teach. I mean, you go to Princeton, you care about your grades, right? So they want to get there, they want to pass the assignment. Well, the study was this. They hired an actor who was pretending to be coughing and hurting and had been hurt that they all would walk by on their way. And they wanted to see how many of them would stop and help the man who was hurting on their way to preach a sermon on the Good Samaritan. 9 out of 10 walked right by him. 9 out of 10 wanted to preach on how to love as God had called us to love, but failed to love as God had called us to love. And so I wonder what the study would be if it looked at our lives and compared how much we want to talk about loving people like Jesus does, and how many times we actually do it when we get the chance to. I think we probably fail maybe even more than that. So as the worship team comes forward today, I believe that study mirrors what we see in ourselves so often, what we see in churches so often. We love to teach loving, but we fail at actually doing it. And so the question that is asked is, what does it mean? What does that mean to love? And Jesus said this, we don't have to wonder. I've given you this answer before, I'll give it to you again. Because if this is the most important, this is what it means to follow God, then you should know this answer. John 15:12-13. This is my commandment. Love each other in the same way I have loved you. There is no greater love than to lay down one's lives for your friends. Is it dangerous to stoop down next to the guy who got robbed on that road? Absolutely. Was it dangerous for Jesus to come here and to love you? Proved to be, didn't it? It cost him his life. And Jesus is saying that's what it means to love. Was it costly for him to pick that man up and put him on his animal and take him where he needed to go? Of course it was. Was it costly for Jesus to come and love us the way that he did? It cost him everything. There is nothing that love should not cost you. That's what it means to love. We look at how Jesus has loved. He left his glory. He separated from the Father to come. So, not just so that you would be loved, but so that you would know what love is, so that it would change your life, so that you can live as he lived, as he created you to live, as he purposed you to live. He gave you a mission. This is not just the church's mission. This is your mission. Every believer in Christ. Not just to love God and talk about it, but to love his sons and daughters that he created in his image, that fill the world around us, that we forget about on our way to the next thing. The most amazing part of the story of the Good Samaritan we so often miss. And that's this. Jesus doesn't tell us anything about the guy who got robbed, does he? We don't know his race. We don't know his job. We don't know what he looked like. Because Jesus was teaching was that didn't matter. Love is never defined by who the other person is. Love is defined by who Jesus is in us and how we show him to the world around us. So as in a moment we stand and sing of his amazing love and are reminded of how much Jesus has loved us, do not sing that and just be filled with some emotional connection. Understand that's a charge. How amazing his love for you is how amazing your love should be for everyone in your life. For your families, for your coworkers, for the stranger on the road, for the person that you disagree with, for the person that hurts you, for the person that hates you. You should love them the way that Jesus loved you. You should give up everything that they might come to hear and know that there's a God who heals, that there's a God who gives hope, that there's a God who restores, that there's a God who gives us the opportunity to leave that life behind and find true life in him. That there's a God who loves them. And then I'll give everything it takes for you to know that. May you love like that. May his love change you so that you may love like him. So let's stand and sing of his amazing love, that he is our King. And because of that, we will love as he does.